Before getting started on today's video, I wanted to share a rather insightful comment from my dehydrate video. So this is a comment by YouTube user Pathfinder, and they provide a pretty valuable reason to be thinking about using underrated spells over some of the more generically good ones. So the way counterspell works in Pathfinder is if someone is trying to counter a spell you cast, they have to have that spell prepared or in their repertoire to be able to counter it. If you're casting less used spells, it's less likely that your GM's NPC spellcasters will even have those spells prepared or in their repertoire. This will make you almost immune to counter spells, which I found pretty interesting, and I hope you find that interesting too. Hello everyone, this is Mathfinder, the home for every math nerd's Pathfinder optimization needs. If you're new here, welcome, and I hope you're here to stay. If you've been here before, welcome back, and thank you for your continued support. Champion's reaction is one of the strongest things in this game. Surely we all agree on this, right? I hope I don't have to elaborate too much. Using a reaction to subtract incoming damage is good. Taking that and adding a debuff, or a mapless strike, or some free allied movement on top of that reduced damage is ridiculously good. Then Howl of the Wild comes along and releases what I believe to be one of the strongest damage mitigation spells in the game, arguably on par with Protector Tree, and everyone's kind of quiet about this spell. A small aside, I love how the best protective spells in this game are all just the wood stops you. Protector Tree, Oaken Resilience, Hidebound, Wooden Double, all of these have a nice thematic cohesion going on. Who says you can't build an effective thematic caster in this game? Anyways, it blows my mind how much Hidebound has flown under the radar. It isn't always as good as Champion's reaction, but it's comparable in a great many situations, and better in a few. So Hidebound is a base second rank spell available to arcane and primal spellcasters. It's a reaction you take when a creature within 60 feet of you is hit with a strike that deals physical damage. It's a pretty simple effect. Until the beginning of that ally's next turn, they will gain resistance 5 to physical damage, except adamantine. Every 2 ranks you heighten it, so 4, 6, 8, 10, the resistance will increase by 3, so the damage is reduced by 8 at rank 4, 11 at rank 6, etc. So before we get into the nitty-gritty of it, I wanted to establish a few baseline assumptions to make sure I am using Hidebound for a fair comparison and not just overvaluing it. To begin with, all our evaluations will be done in the level 7+ range. There are 2 reasons for this. The first is that Hidebound is a second rank spell. Obviously, it's not castable for a level 1 or 2 caster, and at level 3 to 6, it's coming out of a relatively valuable spell slot, which the caster can't necessarily afford. Starting at level 7, this is a spell slot that is 2 ranks below your maximum, so it's worth using. And the second reason is Champion's reaction is available at level 6 to any character who wants it. You can take it via the Champion's archetype. So by narrowing the range to level 7 and higher, I have made the argument more about whether a character should be protecting their allies using Hidebound or using Champion's reaction, provided they're not already a champion. I don't think most characters are going to be tanking better than a Champion's whole package. Remember, Champion's reaction is one part of the champion deal, but a champion as a whole is one of the best tanks in the game. However, a spellcaster can bring a lot of value to the table via this one spell while bringing everything else a spellcaster does to the table. So I think comparing it in this way makes for a relatively fair comparison. The other assumption I want to make is that Hidebound needs to be spammable, just like the champion's reaction attained via an archetype. To this end, at all levels, I will assume this Hidebound is coming out of a spell slot 2 ranks below your maximum. That's kind of my bar for a spell that's considered spammable, because that's also a spell you can cast via a staff, via items, etc. fairly cheaply and fairly gold efficiently, and also you don't need those spell slots for your big combat nukes. Just remember as we go through the math that anytime you cast Hidebound out of your highest rank spell slot, it's probably going to seriously outperform the performance we're showing throughout this video. Let's first start with a simple scenario. We're considering that the party is fighting one enemy and they land 1 hit or crit. So let's say the single enemy is a boss that is 2 levels higher than the party. It could be more. The level of the boss is not really relevant, so let's just say PL plus 2, because that's usually a moderate encounter with a single foe. And we're just going to assume they hit or crit. We're not normalizing this by their chance to hit or crit. And there's no meaningful difference between a hit or crit, because it's not like Champion's Reaction or Hidebound is going to reduce more or less damage in case of a crit. We will also ignore the additional effects of the Champion's Reaction for now, primarily because the Champion's Reaction doesn't need them to comfortably win. Look at this graph starting at level 7 up till 20, and Hidebound is comfortably under the Champion's Reaction in terms of damage reduction here. It's quite clear that it's not as good, it consumes a resource, and reduces less damage. So does that mean Hidebound is just worse? Not exactly, because enemies don't just stand and make one strike, and that one strike is not always guaranteed to hit. So let's complicate the scenario a teensy bit more. Let's say this boss is making 2 strikes. Remember, Hidebound applies until the beginning of that target's next turn, rather than Champion's Reaction, which only applies for that one instance of damage. Now, to make this a fair contest, we would actually need to see how often Hidebound is reducing the damage for 2 strikes rather than 1. So we have to account for the hit or crit chance. I'm going to assume that the target you're defending with Hidebound or Champion's Reaction has standard fighter and medium armor class. So that's usually 10 plus 5 plus your level plus whatever item bonuses you get from defense runes and whatever proficiency a fighter has, which is trained for levels 1 to 10, expert for levels 11 to 16 or 17, I forget which one I used, and then master for the remaining levels. We're assuming the boss is a striker and has a high strike bonus, because that's where this matters the most. If the enemy doesn't have very good strikes, you're not really worried about the damage mitigation from strikes. There's other things you need to be worrying about. Now, the formula for the weighted damage reduction for Hidebound and Champion's Reaction come as follows. For Hidebound, you want to see the probability that one of the 2 strikes misses, but the other hits or crits, and then multiply that by the damage reduction of Hidebound cast at whatever rank you chose. And then you add that damage reduction to 0 misses probability and double the damage of Hidebound for that probability. It's a weighted average of the 2. For Champion's Reaction, you simply take the probability that both of the strikes missed and do 1 minus that, and that will tell you the probability that one or both of the strikes hit or crit. It doesn't really matter which. And the Champion's Reaction will reduce so and so much damage every single time, and you just multiply it by that to get the weighted average. This is what the graph ends up looking like. You can see the gap is a lot closer than before. Now Hidebound is pretty comparable to Champion's Reaction. It is blocking multiple strikes, potentially, and that increases its value relative to Champion's Reaction. At levels 15 to 16, it actually overtakes Champion Reaction, as does it at levels 19 to 20. This is where Hidebound's big advantage shows up. It applies to multiple strikes, so the more strikes an ally is going to take over the course of a round, the higher the value of Hidebound relative to Champion's Reaction. If I had assumed the boss took 3 strikes rather than 2, Hidebound would win pretty comfortably rather than keeping up more or less like it did. This advantage grows even more in multi-target fights. At higher levels, focus fire can be scary, arguably scarier than a single boss taking multiple strikes at you. Minions who are close to the party in level usually have a lot of ways of shutting down players when they outnumber the players, and if they're able to focus their fire against one single player. Hidebound can really help with that. This might immediately lead to the question, Pathfinder, what if I hidebound my ally and the enemies ignore that ally after strike 1? One of 2 things is happening. They're either being forced to split damage that they intended to focus, or they're looking at a suboptimal target rather than the optimal one they were planning on focus firing at the start. So either way, you did your job. You protected your allies. And this can really matter. I assume the fighter had a standard martial AC, but what if the person you hidebounded was a squishy spellcaster? What if the only people in the front line are a somewhat squishier character like the fighter I mentioned and a very heavily armored tank like, say, a monk or a shielded champion or something along those lines? If you hidebound the one they want to focus, they either have to deal suboptimal damage to that one by walking into your resistance, or they have to use their strikes on the other target who was already harder to hit and very good at protecting themselves. So either way, reducing the amount of damage your party takes means you will be preventing somebody from needing a heal in the future. You'll be saving your party resources. You'll increase your party's sustainability overall and efficiency overall. Finally, remember that a mean erases a lot of context. At level 7, for example, Hidebound would reduce an average of 7.25 damage, and Champion would reduce an average of 8.46 damage. What that translates to is Hidebound is blocking 5 damage 43% of the time, and 10 damage 51% of the time. And the Champion is blocking 9 damage 94% of the time. That may seem to favor the Champion, but remember, what matters is the corner cases. When your ally is being hit by 2 strikes, even that 1 extra damage you're blocking relative to the Champion's reaction really does matter. Whereas if your ally is only being hit by 1 strike, the difference between 5 damage and 9 damage isn't all that much. Either is probably going to do a good job keeping your ally standing and not needing heals. So which of the two is better? The truth is, these are very, very comparable options. Champion's reaction is very validly considered one of the strongest reactions in the game. Hidebound may be worse in some situations, better in other situations. It really just depends. These are the lists of upsides for both. And again, if you look at it from the perspective of somebody archetyping into Champion as a way to weaponize their reaction and protect their friends, both of these are valuable. Champion's reaction's big upside is it works against things that are not strikes, and that is always worth looking at. You can use it to protect against an AoE. Hidebound has the comparable upside that it scales really well against a lot of foes making a lot of strikes, or even a single foe making a lot of strikes. Champion's reaction can provide added value on top of the reaction's damage reduction. It can add an extra strike, it can debuff the enemy, it can help your allies move. Conversely, Hidebound will sometimes mess up the enemy's targeting and put them in a no-win situation where either they have to continue walking into a resistance or they have to hit a target they don't like hitting. Champion's reaction has the advantage of scaling really, really well against multiple type damage. For example, if you're fighting a demon that says, I deal so-and-so slashing damage, and so-and-so fire damage, and so-and-so spirit damage, all 3 of them get reduced by whatever value of your Champion's reaction is there. Hidebound has a comparable advantage of having a much better range, so you can be much further away from the fray while still being able to protect your friends. Champion's reaction has the upside of being upgradable by Champion class features, which obviously matters a lot if you're a full class champion as opposed to an archetype one. Hidebound has the advantage of being usable on yourself, which does matter. A caster casting Hidebound might use Hidebound to protect themselves too, although they do have other good options for that as well, but it's still worth noting. Champion's reaction is more easily accessible as an archetype for charisma spellcasters like sorcerers or bards, especially since a lot of sorcerers or bards have features that encourage them to stay close to the fray anyways. Hidebound is available to arcane or primal spellcasters without needing any archetyping, which means you don't need to increase your charisma score or strength score like you do for the Champion's reaction. You can also use this with other features of arcane and primal spellcasters that encourage them to stay away from the fray. All in all, these are very comparable options, and being comparable to Champion's reaction means Hidebound is an incredible spell because Champion's reaction is arguably one of the strongest features in the entire game. And Hidebound is at least comparable, even if it may end up being slightly worse in your evaluation. I think they're roughly equal. So that'll be all for today's video, folks. Hidebound good, that's the takeaway. Before I let y'all go, just a big thank you for helping me reach 1,000 subscribers so quickly and so enthusiastically. I hope I can keep churning out videos that y'all like, and I hope you keep liking my content. Please like, subscribe, and comment for more. And comment if you agree or disagree with any of my takes. I'm always happy to discuss them with you. There's also a 1,000 subscriber special coming soon, so keep your eye out for that. Till later.